So I've titled the presentation Between Apathy and Hysteria. And I think a few years ago, if I had chosen that title, I would have found it really just overly dramatic, between apathy and hysteria. But I do think that actually in very recent times now, we have seen that the world order as we knew it is gone. The changes have been quite abrupt and dramatic, and we have a real paradigm shift with respect to how we see world reality today, with two actual major shifts being climate change, of course, and then the second being artificial intelligence. And I think we need to ask ourselves just two existential questions, one of them being how can humans continue to thrive on this planet in a sustainable way and also keep the planet sustainable? And then the second one being, of course, how can we safeguard and cherish our humanity within this digitally driven world? And I found it very interesting, the first two presentations that I heard, they're addressing exactly some of these same points. And I think part of this, of course, is this idea, too, that both of these meta changes, in theory, could actually drive out humanity, right? That we could, in fact, have humanity through either climate change or through this digital disruption going forward over a very long period of time, hopefully. But this could, of course, create feelings of hysteria within humans with the idea that they may become extinct. And then, of course, we've seen this already with respect to climate change, this sort of panicked dialogue that the world may end soon. And obviously, through this, I think we need to accept the fact that cooler heads must prevail in order for us to continue forward. And part of the reason for this, I think, is there's a huge asymmetry of information and understanding. And because of that, between those that are digitally in the know and those who are not. And this tends to create a situation where people are tuning out, right? They feel they can't really keep up with the technology, they don't really understand it, they're very busy in their day jobs, and they are not really paying attention to what's going on. And this, of course, reflects itself in what was already mentioned, and this is the VUCA world, that which you know, that which you don't know, and then, of course, what you don't know. And that which you know, I think that the feeling is that that's starting to shrink. Yeah, what we know seems to be getting smaller. What we know we don't know even seems to perhaps be getting smaller, because this other larger part seems to, in theory, for many people, I think, just starting to grow exponentially. And of course, that is where apathy can take hold, right? If you feel you're not really in control of your environment, if you feel you're not fully understanding what's going on, you may start to get feelings of apathy. And through this, there, of course, are these sort of dramatic senses. I talked about this idea of human extinction. There's this story of the robot that created, I don't know if you know, with the paperclip, just a very short story. But of course, the robot was programmed to create paperclips in a factory. He's much better, of course, than a human could be. And so he creates paperclips very quickly, very accurately. But he does that. The problem was that, of course, he did not receive any kind of directive to stop, right? So he creates paperclips day and night extensively till he creates, of course, out of the factory a huge paperclip, and goes on to create out of the earth also an immense huge paperclip, and he's looking on to other planets to see where else he can conquer. And of course this is pure science fiction. It has nothing to do, for example, with Asimov's his three rules of robotics, or the four, as I have now understood, or exactly like Elon Musk, where he's saying, of course, that AI is posing the greatest threat to humanity. But this is, of course, again, creating this sense of panic among individuals in terms of AI, which I think we have to realize is also inappropriate. So the idea being is that either of these extremes are not going to be conducive to productive solutions. And my suggestion is that we need to get to what I'm calling the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is a rational and logical discourse between hysteria and apathy. And it's a place where, of course, we maintain our trust in the systems that we have, or that we are going to create, hopefully, maybe better systems even than those which we have. And of course, this idea that human intelligence has to guide artificial intelligence and not the other way around. And so in this context, I'd like to talk specifically today. I'm coming obviously from a finance background, so I'd like to talk a little bit just about artificial intelligence, how it's looking right now within finance. Many AI applications thus far have actually had more to do with retail banking, with retail clients, with fraud detection, with credit scoring, with robo-advising. And this is, of course, through time now changing, but initially it has to be said that most of the success, actually, that a lot of the original initiatives had much more to do with clients who were being underserved by traditional banking. So, in other words, it wasn't that banks were necessarily losing a lot of customers through the original technology. It was more that they were actually reaching out to people who didn't have bank accounts, obviously in a lot of developing countries anyway. So last year, our parent association, I belong to a CFA Institute. It has, I think, 150 societies worldwide. Germany is one of them. Last year, they conducted a global survey of investment professionals, and 73% of the respondents said within their firm they were looking to apply technology to client engagement or to be using machine learning in portfolio construction. And this year, also, a vast majority of our members or industry leaders, they polled industry leaders and members of our association, and they said that they saw machine learning and AI as the biggest source of disruption within investment professionals within the next 5 years. So this has, of course, at the same time, the possibility to bring a lot of improvements. It's not all negative. It has the opportunity, of course, to create from routine tasks a lot of automation, and this should hopefully free up human beings to work on more complex and rewarding tasks. By the way, in case you're wondering about, well, what does she have here, I just want to show we're quite proud that we had only last year one. Branding campaigns are very expensive, and we had this stellen wir Ethik in den Mittelpunkt unseres Handelns. We had this right by the stock exchange in Frankfurt. So I thought just to let everyone see that I'm coming here and we stand for this also with respect to our messaging. So anyway, so freeing up human beings with respect to routine tasks. What's not to like by this? Well, it's the pace for a start. AI is evolving much faster than our regulatory frameworks, than our regulatory oversight, or even, as I mentioned already, our understanding of the technologies can. It's just moving very, very quickly, and there's only a small group of people who are really keeping up with this. And this is true in finance too. And actually, I think this is very hard for finance professionals to accept. The fact that most finance firms, first of all, have a lot of legacy technology, right? Technology that they've had in place for years and years. And so far, their response to aligning these methods has been mostly reactive. And unlike 20 years ago, where basically the best and the brightest headed into finance because it was so lucrative, many financial firms right now are having problems attracting really good IT talent. And this is because, of course, most of the big tech companies like Google or Microsoft, they have more experience and they have more skills, basically, than have been even taught in the top universities around the world. And so most of these elite companies, have employees that have no interest, frankly, to move into finance. So this means financial firms are going to have to play catch up. And one hope, which seems to be persuasive, is that finance latecomers will benefit from the trial and error of the early entrants. And the idea being that they may be able to have technologies where they can, sort of leapfrog forward. But the fact of the matter is that this will be requiring a lot of budget and, of course, a lot of talent. And it's, at this point, quite questionable if, in fact, even some of the largest finance companies will really be able to catch up. And having said that, as CFA Institute, through the studies that we've done, it's just, again, a guess. But they're saying that they believe there'll only be 15 asset management firms remaining globally within the next 10 years. So then we have the current strategy for fintech platforms. And the strategy right now, as many of you probably know, is component replacement, right? Aimed at introducing some kind of functionality. It's either cheaper, faster, or safer than legacy platforms. We talked already about the blockchain systems. They obviously have this capacity to change significantly custodial institutions, anything that has to do with brokering with the middle person. And they would be able to, of course, then record these transactions securely in the cloud. Right now, I think blockchain has its issues, what we discussed. It's also still quite expensive to do on a larger scale. There's regulatory questions. But it could, in theory, be a game changer. It's also very important aspect that, of course, it's kind of providing that trust within the technology. And of course, that trust, as we know, capital markets, the oxygen that capital markets need to breathe is trust. So in theory, it could be a game changer. I found it interesting, someone mentioned about quantum computing. And the fact is that we've been doing some sort of side work looking into, we have some contacts within that area. And if it's to be believed, quantum computing may be able to come in within the next 4 or 5 years, this is what they're claiming, with new technology which would be able to completely hack the blockchain. So stay tuned, that's a different presentation, but I just wanted to throw that out there. So just when you think you know what's coming, something else may be coming around the curve. And then beyond that, of course, with the platform completion and within fintech, actually it's been mostly thus far partnerships. Right? Originally, I think the huge fear of banks was that, for example, the robo-advising, they would come in and take over banks. It hasn't been that way. In fact, it's been more complementary, right? Instead of disruptive, large firms have actually just paired up with some of the most promising of these robo-advisor fintechs, and they've just added them into their own platform. And then maybe most significantly, though, there's always this question of, we say, the race to AI. And the question is, what are we actually racing to, right? But actually, it does make some sense, because the largest IT companies have such an advantage now with respect to some of their data that they've been able to gather, and of course, the advanced platforms that they've been able to create. So there is some question that actually many of these fintech platforms, for example, will ultimately come in and actually choose either Google or Amazon's artificial intelligence and use some sort of platform that's going to be provided by them. And I think you see this coming already right now. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett, but you know what I'm talking about with the insurance. They're working with Amazon right now and with JP Morgan. It's all very hush-hush. We don't exactly know what's going to come out of it. But this looks to be at least a model that could be going forward for the future, this idea that people are using the platform of an Amazon or a Google and adding onto it with their own customized knowledge. But of course, this still doesn't stop banks, even right now, from at least trying to do it themselves. And they are doing so. They're doing quite a lot of artificial intelligence technology in lending, in detecting fraud, which I mentioned. That's one of the key original components of this, in operations, in HR, account opening, et cetera. And of course, just anywhere where you can basically automate your tasks. And of course, through this transition provides a real opportunity for investment professionals. And it provides an opportunity, I'm not sure how many of you, now after this, I haven't made finance sound so attractive. I hope that some of you don't get the idea that it's still not a great place to be. I feel very strongly about the fact that we need the next generation to come in and show us, again, how finance can be done well from a human perspective, and obviously from a technological perspective. And that's exactly what they're saying we're going to be needing. Here you see the investment professional of the future. They've just put out, this was also a CFA Institute study that has come out, and this is part of the title of my presentation, was this idea of combining AI and HI, right? Artificial intelligence and human intelligence. This was a little bit what the first professor called integrale Intelligenzia. And with the idea that, of course, either alone is weaker than the combination together. And that ideally leveraging both, and of course that humans themselves still have the ethical orientation, the transparency, the communication skills, very important, the empathy, the tacit knowledge of the product or the topic, and of course this idea of trust interaction, which are obviously things that technology still cannot provide. And then within the companies, the idea of teams is going to get more and more important. We've seen that already over probably the last 5 or 10 years, that this idea of the, for example, in the finance world, the star portfolio manager is dwindling very, very dramatically. Diversity in teams will be sought also to achieve the best results. And then obviously we talk about T-shaped skills. This idea that, of course, the vertical, that people have deep knowledge within a certain segment, but then that they're able to collaborate very well, and that's sort of the horizontal part of the T. You're not working in silos anymore. That was part of what caused probably the great financial crisis, was the fact that you had very smart people, but they weren't talking to each other. So you want to create that communication, and then in the middle there, in sort of, again, if I can use the word sweet spot, in that T is innovation. And it's this idea of taking technology and taking the skills and taking the human aspect and taking the technical aspect and having people working in that innovation, engineering, management, facilitation area to have it come together. And beyond that, of course, leadership skills are in more demand than ever. So with the idea that you also then have a huge opportunity, I think, to influence people in a positive way within these teams. And then beyond that, we also have to have a company culture, and that was the final part actually of this study of the investment professional of the future, which was quite interesting, is that you had a huge increase in the importance of the culture of your company itself. Going forward, people are relating far, far more to where they're working. It's very important for people now that are going into the job world to have an environment where they feel comfortable, where they understand and feel understood. And this all gives obviously opportunities though for companies and for management to really take that and create positive cultures, and obviously within that keep a very good talent then for themselves. So this all sounds quite good, but there are issues, right? We've kind of come into this area, right? We talked about simple AI, yeah, and it's very funny because this is just amazing. This is just so perfect. I'm looking, there's, you know, I won't say anything yet. Let me just keep talking here, right? So, there's so we talked about the fact that in finance we're not quite as far, of course, as some of these really high-tech firms like Google and Amazon. But of course, there's still a lot going on in finance at a very high level, and there's still a need to create transparency within that. And of course, from fixed algorithms until true artificial intelligence, we kind of entered into that space already, right? We've already entered into it without much thought about, you know, best practice, about safety, about ethics, etc. And then on top of it, if the algorithms around us are not yet intelligent, meaning they're able to recognize calculations or say, this doesn't look right, but I'll try it again, they're still starting already, though, to learn from their environments. And the fact of the matter is, once the algorithm starts to learn, it's you know, a big question of how can we be certain how it's interacting with the other algorithms, how it's interacting with the physical world, and ultimately, of course, how it's interacting with us. And we had a situation back a few years ago with, I don't know if all of you are familiar here with high-frequency trading, but the historian George Dyson had been talking about the fact that there are quite a few firms, I know for a fact in New York, probably all across major centers around the world, companies that are just having, taking small amounts of money and, quote, letting the black box try different things with small amounts of money. If it works, then we reinforce those rules. We know that it's been done, and then you actually have rules where nobody knows what the rules actually are. The algorithms create their own rules. Then you let them evolve the same way nature evolves organisms. And in his 2011 novel, The Fear Index, Robert Harris talks about exactly the same issue, which is basically the emergence, again, of singularity or human-level intelligence for machines. And it's exactly that same concept, right? That you have this uncontrolled, organic, digital evolution. And even though I think that that's probably not our primary concern right now, much more widespread is the concern of big data. And you see my slide here. There have been a series of data slip-ups. They've been mostly visible from the large tech corporations so far, who, of course, for years have been gathering proprietary digital data. And what's apparent is that if machines provide false and flawed data, that if machines are provided with biased and flawed data, then they're going to produce biased and flawed results. And we've had many examples of those: IBM, Microsoft, MEGV. They were found, and you probably know this, they can identify 99% of the time a photo, but they can only do that if it's a white male. And if it's, for example, a woman of color, the percentage, sinks dramatically, right? And of course, there have been a long series of these kind of these episodes, and you have to ask yourself, how can this be? These very sophisticated programmers, right? And now I get finally to my slide here, you have to consider the source, right? 97% of algorithms are programmed by men, many of whom are weird, right? And of course, this weird aspect, again, just this W-E-I-R-D, white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Right? And so I have to ask myself, and just to be very, very clear, this is not at all unusual for me. In fact, many times I'm doing this sort of events, moderating events at my society. We have 85 events a year, so I'm maybe, certainly not at all of those, but doing quite a few during the year. And there have been numerous times, even in recent years, where I go, Meine Herren, yeah. I start the greeting and I realize I'm the only woman in the room. And so I think the question to me is, does it matter, right? That things that are profoundly changing and shaping our society are being created by a small group of people that have very specific experience, right? And I think, we have to, ask ourselves if it isn't legitimate too that there could be concern that we need to have more diversity with respect to not just, the machines themselves, but who's providing the programming for these machines. And the fact of the matter is that, we have this issue too because, and I was just last night, we had an event last night on big data, is that without exception almost, and it's very well-meaning, it's not, when we talk here about the idea of this, this issue, it's not because these individuals are trying to do anything that's wrong, right? That's just to be very, very clear, right? But the fact of the matter is that we believe that, that machines are objective, right? And the question is just how objective can machines be? Now this is just one slide that we did from, we had a survey it was only about 6 weeks ago, where we were actually going through these two, what I talked about, the two meta trends of sustainability or ESG, and the second one being artificial intelligence. And this is just one snapshot to give you all an idea of how our members see it. We asked what is the greatest opportunity and the greatest risk, right, of AI implementation. And as you see here, again, as also is officially being shown, increased efficiency was seen as as sort of the largest opportunity. And of course, interestingly enough, as they're saying here, actually one of the opportunities is to create less bias, right? And I think that's exactly how most people honestly think. And then with respect to risk, this idea of model overconfidence, but in fact, the increased bias aspect is far smaller. But right now, it appears at least as though at the stage that we are all at right now with artificial intelligence, that we have to pay a lot more attention actually to this data issue and this idea of garbage in, garbage out. And again, not meaning it implying that somehow the individuals that are doing it are doing something wrong. It's just a question of, are we really looking at it from a broad enough perspective? So, and so anyway, and this of course then we call this also math washing, right? And this is this idea, right, that's become more prevalent that a program is widely considered to be more neutral decision making than a human, right? And there's a professor from IT that says we have a tendency to idolize programs like Facebook as being entirely objective because they have mathematics at their core. And of course, again, we know this is not true. And indeed, it could be even more dangerous with respect to having this machine learning, because it's, again, hard to know sometimes why a machine has made a decision. And then again, there's also this idea of amplification. There are many programs that, for example, one that was reviewing 100,000 images from the internet, and it had a biased association, and instead of maintaining that bias, that bias actually became amplified over time, right? So it's not just replicating bias, it's actually taking it and then exponentially increasing it. So what needs to be done, right? To confront this, we obviously need robust artificial intelligence frameworks to underscore the importance, of course, of the human and the moral values that we all share. And what should that look like? And of course, the first and foremost important point is human involvement, right? What is the actual goal that you're trying to create? What is the purpose of the algorithm? What is the actual definition of success? And to have that clearly stated from a human perspective. And then, of course, to create that transparent human accountability so that it's clear at the end of the day that someone is either responsible in terms of success or failure. And then to shine light on the data. In our opinion, data is right now in this phase, again, the key. It's been called the new oil. Data is the new oil. I'm not sure if we want to keep that, but without relevant data, again, that is of a high quality, meaning it's representative, it's accurate, it's unbiased. And again, I've also seen a quote, unbiased data is an oxymoron. It's almost impossible to get unbiased data, right? But regardless, the best intentioned algorithm can go wrong if the data at least is not as good as it potentially could be. And we have the situation now already that much data is actually has been bought from some other vendor who's bought it from some other vendor, so that it's very hard actually to even know, who owns this data, or who is responsible for the data. And to put this challenge in just a slightly greater perspective, not over 90% of all the data in existence has been collected in the past 2 years. So even if you do get good data, that data just by definition will be a reflection of the past, or at the very best, a reflection of the status quo. And the question is just, is that also legitimate to actually extrapolate and create, future forecasts? That's a question that I'm not here to answer, but should be being asked. And then, of course, we have the model. It must be understood with respect to the assumptions in the model, what are the margins of error, et cetera. And then governance structures, of course, as Professor Vieweg is sort of his pet peeve, governance structures must be created within the companies to assure that that's all documented and consistent with the strategy, goals, and cultures of the firm. Now, I put up here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, this book, Weapons of Math Destruction. But this is I met her earlier this year at a conference. This is Cathy O'Neill. She wrote the book. She's a Harvard mathematician, or was a Harvard mathematician, who also did a lot of work within the big data space. And now she's written this book, and she's created her own company, which is called here O'Neill Risk Consulting and Algorithmic Auditing, right? It's the age of the algorithm, and we have arrived unprepared. Okay, yeah, and then so of course with the idea though that it's not just people like Cathy O'Neill that's doing this. I mean, all of the big four, all of the accounting companies right now, for example, are hard at work trying to figure out in this new phase now how they are supposed to sort of adjust to this new world of auditing, where they're also potentially having to audit also artificial intelligence. And we talked a little bit about GDPR. And this idea that GDPR right now is basically the world standard with respect to data protection. I find it interesting. Google, as many of you know, probably have their global center for data security in Munich. And they've been quoted as saying Europe is the global leader in data security, and Germany is Europe's leader. And while attention to duty or consequences is fundamentally a focus on compliance, virtue ethics is looking at whether an action is consistent with being a virtuous person, right? It's looking at the character. It's the character of the individual. And of course, clearly, historically, the emphasis on compliance has been the most profound. And this concept of virtue ethics as having an important role in business has been historically primarily ignored. And it's been just really in recent years, since the financial crisis, that companies have really seen just how important culture is, and the fact that this is reflected, of course, in the characters of their employees. And so it's not just the process, right? The process being basically the sort of the duty-based to have what you're supposed to be doing. And it's not just the result, that's the consequence, right, that counts. But it's also actually the individuals in these teams, and especially, of course, the management, that should be reflecting these ethical values and showing, of course, this moral character. And in the firm of the future, as we talked about earlier in my slide, this positive culture is what's really forecasted as being the key element to success in this new digital world. So I'm going to take us back 2,000 years. Aristotle famously said, what we are is what we repeatedly do, and believed, of course, through this that there's this virtuous cycle, right? Virtuous behavior can be developed through repeated ethical actions, and a virtuous character leads to ethical actions. And so based on this, I teach, for example, about this idea of how modern portfolio theory could now in some ways be called legacy portfolio theory. Because many of the premises that I grew up with, that we grew up with, as I learned microeconomics, it was a science. That was just, of course, how the world works. We learned it all and memorized it all, and went into our jobs believing that to be true. And of course, many of these premises have been shown to be very outdated. With, of course, this rationality and this rational homo economicus is no longer looking so smart. And also, from your slide, also the unemotional utilitarianism, self-interest, which formed, of course, this backbone of business school educations for decades, has became something actually of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because, of course, you go to business school, you learn that's how it's supposed to be done. And so you come out of it and you go into the business world, and you basically have this idea that business is amoral, right? Not immoral, but amoral, meaning that it has no, no ethical premise whatsoever, right? So, you're behaving then in a way that in a business context, something is acceptable to you that, of course, in a private context would never be. And this sort of thinking, of course, also allowed, for example, the Wall Street character Gordon Gekko to actually serve as a role model, right? I mean, we think about this now, and it's kind of shocking. And of course, we know that we're not rational, right? And each of us know this. And of course, Daniel Kahneman has also made that famous for us. And most importantly, business is also not void of morality. So this fascination, though, that we humans have with objective rationality has inspired, of course, great thinkers over the centuries. And now, again, back to, interestingly enough, a very similar slide, where I'm saying also, right, this idea, before we were worshiping the analog Homo economicus, now we are moving into worship of the Homo digitalis, yeah? We are looking and trying to, again, achieve this ultimate rationality through the machine, but again, through this idea that it's not going to work, this idea of math washing will come and bite us again in the behind. So we have to keep ourselves informed, we have to hold ourselves accountable, and maybe also more importantly, we also have to solve this problem, what we call of the many hands, and this is what I responded to earlier. It's very complex, before you talked about the complexity. For example, airplanes, companies have been able to figure out, of course, with planes with the black box exactly what happened, right? And we need sort of this mentality to be coming into artificial intelligence. So finally, we need to appreciate the role of human beings. We need to appreciate the role of human intelligence in civilization. Why do we have the earth if we don't make it a good place for us to be? The core human virtues, the traditional classic cardinal virtues, were temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And coming now very back to the beginning of my presentation, I said we wanted to move into the sweet spot between apathy and hysteria. And if we do that, in order to do that, I think that there's of course then one virtue that we need the most, and that is courage, right? We need courage because it's the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. So I'd like to ask all of you, and especially so many young people in here, to please have that courage, right, as you're moving forward, right? We need that to thrive in this new world. You have to be asking the right questions, and it's never been more important to value and cherish this collective human intelligence. And finally, the machines are not going to take over unless we let them. Right? So the point being is that you're asking those questions, and just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.